my grandfather stormed Iwo Jima. At 19 years old, he stepped foot on an 8-mile long, 3-mile wide slab of volcanic rock that would become one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in American history. Overlooking the island, there was a 550-foot mountain known as Mount Suribachi, named due to its resemblance to a Japanese grinding bowl. The Japanese had prepared for the invasion for months. By the time the Marine Corps had landed on the island, the Japanese had an unspeakably vast array of artillery, machine guns, and mines defending the island. Most of the artillery was dug into the side of the mountain overlooking the island. Mount Grinding Bowl was a strangely suiting name for the situation. Every inch of ground gained by the Marines would cost them blood. The island has since become hallowed ground for the Marine Corps. Every square inch holds 1,000 stories of the titanic struggle between the empire of the rising sun and the sleeping giant that was the United States. Thousands of lives were lost there. And while the battlefield on the surface of the island has since cleaned up and recovered, old bones still haunt the island beneath the surface. My grandfather, shortly before his passing, told me of the fight for Mount Suribachi. Most people know of that mountain because of the timeless photograph of the flag raising. The photograph would prompt Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal to declare, "The raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. But the battle for Suribachi that my father told me did not take place on top of the mountain, but beneath it. As the Marines began climbing the mountain, fighting for every square inch of ground, my grandfather's squad took to the tunnels. The Japanese had constructed many of miles of tunnels and spider holes beneath the island. The tunnels connected the dozens of artillery positions, machine gun nests, and thousands of spider holes. The Japanese soldiers would pop up at the most unexpected places at the most unexpected times, fire a few shots, throw a couple of grenades, and disappear back into the earth. Many Marine squads had at least one individual armed with a flamethrower that would be used to clear the tunnels and bunkers. My grandfather's squad did not have one, however. They came to a tunnel entrance near the base of the mountain. They tossed a few grenades in and waited until after the explosions to enter. Armed with their rifles and carbines and a few handheld flashlights, they dove into the tunnel system. My grandfather, only a 19-year-old lance corporal, still with acne on his face, was point man, the first to enter the tunnel. The tunnel was wide enough for 2 individuals to stand side by side. Immediately upon entering, 3 Japanese soldiers charged them with bayonets. My grandfather dropped the first with his M1 carbine. The second and third Japanese soldier were killed by shots from an M1 Garand from the Marine to my grandfather's left. That Marine was Corporal Whitehorse. Whitehorse was infamous for his homemade moonshine he would make from raisins the Marines would occasionally receive from their rations. They continued farther into the tunnels. Occasionally, the ground would shake and dust would fall from the roof as the naval artillery pounded targets on the island into oblivion. Sometimes they would hear the thunderous report of the Japanese's own artillery as they answered from bunkers dug into the mountainside. That was my grandfather's squad's mission: to find and neutralize the Japanese artillery that was too well protected from naval bombardment. The battle was in full pitch. Hundreds of men were dying all around them. They came to many forks and splits in the underground system. Each new passageway had to be cleared. The Marines took contact from fanatical Japanese soldiers many times. Each time, the Japanese soldiers were dropped by effective and accurate fire from the squad of Marines. Further and further, they delved into the belly of the mountain. What seemed like hours later, my grandfather and his squad came to a chamber carved out of the rock. In the chamber lay 2 surgical tables, dried blood and gore still pooled on the tables and floor surrounding them. A gurney with dozens of wicked and nefarious surgical instruments gleamed under the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A table by the wall held a sheaf of papers and folders, all written in Japanese. The Marines, although spooked by this macabre setting, collected the papers, which likely held valuable intel, and moved deeper still. Suddenly, they heard an unholy scream. My grandfather described it as something between a mountain lion and a man in pain. A minute or two after hearing the ungodly sound, they came to a fork in the passage. Out of the left-hand tunnel came a creature born out of the devil's fever dream. A tangle of bone and sinew, shaped like a pair of spiders attached to their backs, lunged at them. It leapt through the air as the Marines fired upon the thing and landed on Corporal Whitehouse, knocking my grandfather down to the side. It tore and stabbed at the corporal with pieces of broken and protruding bone. The Marine screamed and flailed beneath the creature. It opened its horridly malformed mouth and bit down on his head. With a wet crunch, Corporal Whitehouse's screams abruptly ceased. The Marines kept firing at the beast. My grandfather said he could see the bullets hitting their mark as pieces of the creature flew off and holes punched into its body. The kind of firepower they threw at the thing would have brought down a bear. With every shot that hit its mark, the creature flinched and took a step back. Finally, it screamed at the Marines and retreated back into the tunnels. Whitehorse was all too obviously dead. They collected his dog tags and moved on. My grandfather told me he would be lying if he said they all were not scared out of their minds. They came to another chamber in the tunnels, this one smaller than the first. They smelled it long before they came to it though. The stench of decay caused many of them to double over and vomit. When they found that chamber, they were all thankful they had nothing left in their stomachs to toss up. It was filled, packed with mutilated, rotting corpses. Most were skinned, dried flesh gleaming dully in the glow of their flashlights. Many were headless, others were missing their limbs. One was sawed neatly in half lengthwise. Some were cut apart and sewn back together at odd angles. But the body that stuck out to my grandfather the most was one that was once a kid. The kid appeared to be Chinese. He was not mutilated like the others were. Instead, he lay there with simply a small hole in his forehead. The squad leader, a gruff and crusty, and what they thought was an old man that was only 26 years old, named Sergeant Mayers, declared that they were going to get out of those godforsaken tunnels right then and there. With the trail of spent brass, bullet holes, and bodies they had been leaving, it shouldn't have been hard to find their way out. They began backtracking. They reached the spot where Whitehorse had been killed and found that creature crouched over his lifeless body, eating him. My grandfather screamed in righteous fury and let loose with his carbine, emptying an entire magazine into the creature. It screamed, leapt up into the air, and latched onto the roof of the tunnel. It scurried towards them with unnerving speed and agility. It dropped onto my grandfather, impaling his right thigh with a piece of broken bone that served as the tip of one of its legs. My grandfather fought with all his might to keep the thing from stabbing and tearing him to death. He became washed over with a stench of death and rot that clung to the creature as he dodged its multiple limbs. His squadmates, afraid of accidentally shooting my grandfather, held their fire. Sergeant Mayers charged the beast and clubbed it with the buttstock of his M1 Garand. It raised its head at him and let loose an ear-shattering scream, revealing multiple rows of human teeth as it did so. Sergeant Mayers kept beating it, It lunged forward with its front limbs extended and impaled Sergeant Meyers through the abdomen. He dropped to his knees. Then, as it reared back, its jaws open, preparing to bite down on Sergeant Meyers' head and finish the job, the other Marines let loose a volley of fire. The creature spun around again and again, its razor-sharp limbs flailing wildly. It slashed one Marine across the stomach and slammed another into the tunnel wall. My grandfather got up and limped to Whitehorse's body and rummaged through his pack. At the bottom, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a bottle of Whitehorse's moonshine. My grandfather grabbed it and a shred of cloth. He uncorked the bottle and stuffed the opening with a cloth, leaving some hanging out. He lit the cloth and threw it at the nightmare creature. The creature went up in flames with a horrid, long, drawn-out shriek of mindless agony. It sprinted into the adjacent tunnel and disappeared, screaming until the sounds of the raging battle outside the tunnels drowned it out. The remaining Marines collected their wounded and dead and made their way back out of the tunnel systems. Sergeant Meyers had bled out before they reached the entrance of the tunnels. Eventually, they reached the daylight once again. They limped their way to a temporary forward HQ set up on a beachhead. A captain had seen them stumbling up to the HQ and immediately called for medical assistance. The Marine officers were skeptical of what my grandfather and his squad mates told him about their encounter in the tunnels. He and the other wounded Marines in his squad were loaded onto a landing boat and taken to a ship for medical treatment. The wound in my grandfather's leg was becoming infected with unusual rapidity. Already, the ships around the island were becoming crowded with dead and wounded Marines. A few days later, aboard that same ship, he watched the American flag raise on the summit of Mount Suribachi. He said the triumphant roar from the thousands of Marines and sailors as the foreign flag was raised over Japan home territory for the first time in over 1,000 years was enough to shake the pearly gates of heaven. My grandfather was given a Purple Heart for wounds received from a Japanese bayonet and diagnosed with battle fatigue. We now refer to it as PTSD, and sent back to the States. The surviving Marines from his squad were given the same diagnosis. My grandfather was tough, mentally and physically. He denied and contested the diagnosis of PTSD until his dying day, but said the shrieks and screams and the stench of that monster still haunted him. In my heart, I know he encountered something beneath the blood-soaked sand of Iwo Jima. War is hell.